Picture this. It's 1807. John Colter is running for his life through the Montana wilderness, completely naked. His feet are leaving bloody prints on the ice. The Blackfoot warriors hunting him through the frozen night don't know they're chasing a man who will help birth an entirely new breed of human being, a man who has learned to transform sleep itself into a weapon. Now, here's the thing that gets me about this moment. Colter isn't just running from death. He's running towards something that will fundamentally change what it means to be awake in the American wilderness. Because in the decades that follow, men like him will push the boundaries of human consciousness so far beyond normal limits that they'll create a brotherhood of the perpetually vigilant. Men who literally forget how to sleep like civilized human beings. And it starts with Manuel Lisa's 1st Brigade heading up the Missouri River in 1808. Think about what these men packed. Really think about it. Feather pillows. Actual feather pillows. They hauled these things up the Missouri River like they were heading to some frontier bed and breakfast. Within 6 months, they were burning those same pillows for warmth, learning to rest their heads on stone and snow instead of down and cotton. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened one sleepless night at a time. Hugh Glass, yes, that Hugh Glass, the one who would later crawl 200 miles after a grizzly bear tried to turn him into dinner, perfected the art of sleeping in hollowed logs packed with moss. Not because it was comfortable. Comfort was a luxury that got you killed. He did it because a log offered protection on 3 sides, and moss muffled the sound of your breathing. But Glass was just one man learning one technique. What was happening across the entire fur trade was something unprecedented in human history. These weren't soldiers following orders. These weren't explorers with government backing. These were entrepreneurs, gamblers, and desperados who were systematically rewiring their own nervous systems for profit. Jim Beckworth, IS, mountain man, trader, and one of the most fascinating characters you'll never hear enough about, discovered what they called the compass sleep method. Picture 20 men arranged like the points of a compass, feet pointing toward cardinal directions. Why? Because when you're that exhausted, your body loses its ability to sense approaching danger. But if you align yourself with magnetic north, some primitive part of your brain stays oriented even in the deepest sleep. The Crow Indians taught them this, and here's what's incredible. It worked. That first winter, this technique saved 12 documented lives. 12 times, men woke up knowing exactly which direction death was approaching from. Old Pierre Menard, veteran trader and meticulous record keeper, AG, documented 37 different sleeping positions his men developed. 37. Each one designed for specific terrains and threat levels. The cliff sleep for mountain ledges, the root sleep for forest floors, the stone sleep for desert camps, the water sleep for riverbanks where the sound of current masked footsteps. These weren't just survival techniques, they were the birth of a new kind of human consciousness. The Crow had another trick that sounds impossible, until you realize these men's lives depended on impossible things becoming possible. They taught the mountain men to sleep with one eye literally open, not metaphorically. Literally. The eyelid would rest half closed, allowing just enough vision to detect movement while maintaining enough darkness for the brain to enter sleep cycles. Modern sleep researchers would tell you this is medically impossible, but tell that to the families of the 12 men whose lives it saved that first winter. Now think about this. What were these men giving up? They were abandoning one of the most basic human needs, the need for deep restorative sleep, in exchange for what? Money? Adventure? Freedom? No. They were trading their ability to sleep for the right to stay alive in a landscape that killed most men who entered it. The psychological cost was immediate and brutal. Pierre Menard's journals describe men who would jerk awake at the sound of wind through pine needles, Men whose hands would instinctively reach for rifles that weren't there when they heard unfamiliar sounds. Men who developed what we would now recognize as hypervigilance disorders. But here's what makes this story so compelling. They kept going. They kept pushing deeper into territories where sleep meant death. They kept developing new techniques, new ways of staying conscious when consciousness itself became a survival skill. The beaver trade was exploding. Every stream, every valley, every hidden corner of the Rocky Mountains represented potential fortune. But fortunes went to the men who could trap during the day and stay alert through the night. Sleep became the luxury that separated the living from the dead. And the men who mastered this balance, they became legends. Kit Carson would eventually perfect the 20-minute sleep cycle, any micronaps, that allowed him to cover twice the territory of his competitors. Jim Bridger would develop the ability to sleep standing against trees for days at a time, earning a reputation as the man who never fully slept. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1807, these techniques were still being discovered. Men were still dying because they slept too deeply, or in the wrong positions, or in places where their snoring could be heard by enemies a quarter-mile away. The learning curve was written in blood. What fascinates me about this period is how quickly human adaptation can occur when the alternative is extinction. These men weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people pushed into extraordinary circumstances. And when faced with the choice between sleep and survival, they chose survival. Again and again and again, until choosing survival became so automatic that they forgot how to choose anything else. The Shoshone had a phrase for what these men were becoming. Roughly translated, it meant those who dream while walking, who walk while dreaming. Men caught between consciousness and unconsciousness, existing in a twilight state that allowed them to function in a landscape that would kill normal human beings. But functioning came at a cost. Always there was a cost. By 1810, fur traders were reporting men who would sleep for 3 days straight after returning from the mountains, then pace their cabins for weeks, unable to rest indoors. Men whose eyes never fully closed, even in deepest sleep. Men who had trained their bodies so thoroughly to be ready for violence that peaceful sleep became physically impossible. The rendezvous gatherings, Comteish, those legendary summer meetings where mountain men would trade furs, swap stories, and reconnect with what remained of civilization, became laboratories for sleep experimentation. Men would compare techniques, trade secrets, demonstrate new methods of staying alert while appearing unconscious. And through it all, one truth emerged. In the wilderness, sleep wasn't rest. Sleep was strategy. The question that haunted these early mountain men, the question that would define the next 3 decades of fur trading, was simple. How long can a human being maintain this level of vigilance before something fundamental breaks? They were about to find out. Because what started with John Colter running naked through the Montana night was about to become an empire built on the systematic destruction of one of humanity's most basic needs. An empire where sleep itself would become both currency and weapon, where rest would be rationed like ammunition, and where the ability to stay awake would separate the living from the dead. The sleepless brotherhood was born, and once you joined it, there was no going back. The mountains were calling, fortunes were waiting, and sleep. Sleep was for men who valued comfort over gold, rest over glory, peace over the kind of money that could change everything. These men chose differently, and that choice would transform not just their own consciousness, but the very nature of survival in the American wilderness. But first, they had to learn the rules of their new existence. Rules written not in books, but in the accumulated wisdom of men who had figured out how to stay alive when staying alive should have been impossible. And the first rule was simple. In the mountains, when you close your eyes, you better be ready to open them fighting. By 1820, something unprecedented was happening in the Rocky Mountains. Sleep had become currency, not gold, not beaver pelts, sleep itself. The fur trade was exploding across the American West, and every major company was pushing their men to trap every profitable stream from the Missouri to the Pacific. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The brigade that could cover the most territory in the shortest time would claim the richest beaver grounds. And covering territory meant one thing: learning to function on impossibly little rest. Kit Carson figured it out first. Carson, who would later become one of the most famous scouts in American history, was still just a teenage runaway from Missouri when he discovered what he called the 20-minute sleep cycle. Think about this for a moment. Most human beings need 7 to 8 hours of sleep to function normally. Carson trained his body to operate on 20-minute intervals of unconsciousness, repeated throughout the day and night. The result? He could cover twice the territory of his competitors while maintaining the kind of alertness that kept him alive in country where relaxing your guard for 30 seconds could mean death. But Carson wasn't working in isolation. Across the mountains, other men were making similar discoveries. Jim Bridger, the man who had become known as the greatest mountain man of them all, allegedly learned to sleep standing against trees for 3 days straight while tracking stolen horses, not leaning against trees. Standing, his legs locked, his body vertical, his rifle ready to fire. Modern sleep researchers would tell you this is physiologically impossible. But then again, modern sleep researchers have never had Blackfoot war parties hunting them through the Yellowstone wilderness. Here's what gets me about this period. These men weren't just adapting to harsh conditions. They were systematically rewriting the rules of human consciousness, and they were doing it in the most competitive environment imaginable. Because while Carson and Bridger were perfecting their techniques, their competitors were perfecting theirs. William Ashley's men, Sleep, the legendary Rocky Mountain Fur Company, developed what they called tactical sleep deception. They would create false camps complete with log dummies arranged around cold fire pits, while the real trappers slept in hidden positions 200 yards away. In 1823, this technique saved their lives. An Arikara war party discovered the fake camp at dawn and launched a full assault on the log dummies. While the warriors were focused on their attack, Ashley's men ambushed them from concealed positions, having been awakened by the sound of war cries echoing across the valley. The practice that emerged from this success became known as story sleeping. One man would stay partially awake, telling tales in a low voice to keep his companions in light sleep rather than deep unconsciousness. The storyteller's voice would change rhythm and tone if he detected any threats, instantly alerting the entire group without the need for shouting or sudden movements. At the Green River Rendezvous, ISR, those legendary summer gatherings where mountain men would trade, drink, and share information, RAT, story sleeping, became an art form. Men would compete to see who could tell the most engaging tales while maintaining perfect vigilance. The best story sleepers could keep 20 men in the perfect state between consciousness and unconsciousness for entire nights. But it was the Shoshone who taught these mountain men their most valuable skill: dream control. Now, this sounds like mystical nonsense until you understand what was actually happening. When you're operating on 2 or 3 hours of broken sleep for weeks at a time, your mind starts playing tricks on you. Exhausted brains create phantom enemies, shadows become warriors, wind through trees becomes approaching footsteps. The Shoshone taught mountain men to wake themselves at will from nightmares, not just startling awake, but maintaining enough consciousness during sleep to recognize when their dreams were becoming dangerous and pulling themselves back to full alertness before panic could set in. Jim Beckwourth became the acknowledged master of this technique. He could enter what he called controlled dreaming, a state where part of his mind remained on guard duty while the rest attempted to rest. Beckwourth claimed he could dream about pursuing buffalo herds while simultaneously listening for the sound of approaching horses in the real world. Sleep intelligence networks began forming. Knowing when rival brigades rested became as valuable as knowing where they trapped. Scouts would shadow competing groups for days, learning their sleep patterns, identifying their most vulnerable moments. Some brigades would deliberately vary their rest schedules to prevent this kind of surveillance. The psychological pressure was enormous. Imagine trying to sleep when you know that falling too deeply unconscious might allow competitors to steal your traps, your furs, or your life. Some men developed what we would now recognize as chronic insomnia. Others created such elaborate defensive sleeping arrangements that setting up camp took longer than the actual trapping. But here's what's truly remarkable about this period. Despite the pressure, despite the competition, despite the constant threat of death, these men were getting better at their craft. The techniques they developed weren't just keeping them alive, they were making them more effective trappers, better scouts, superior wilderness survivors. The legendary mountain man Joe Meek perfected what he called sentinel sleeping. He would train his body to wake up every 18 minutes throughout the night, scan his surroundings for threats, then return to sleep. His internal clock became so precise that other men would use Meek as their alarm system, knowing that his regular awakening would alert them to any dangers. By 1825, the transformation was complete. The Rocky Mountains were populated by men who had fundamentally altered their relationship with consciousness itself. They had learned to treat sleep not as a period of vulnerability, but as a tactical advantage, and they were about to discover just how far they could push the human mind before something essential broke. The Rendezvous of 1826 saw the first organized sleep competitions. Men would bet on who could stay awake the longest while maintaining full alertness. The winner was a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste, who managed 72 hours of continuous consciousness while successfully identifying every sound, movement, and potential threat in the surrounding wilderness. Baptiste collected his winnings and promptly hallucinated for 3 days straight. But the competitions continued, because in a world where sleep itself had become a weapon, the man who could master consciousness itself held the ultimate advantage. The question was no longer whether these techniques worked. The question was whether the human mind could sustain them indefinitely. These men were about to find out, and the answer would transform not just their own lives, but the very nature of survival in the American wilderness. Between 1825 and 1840, something extraordinary happened in the Rocky Mountains. The mountain men didn't just perfect inhuman sleep patterns, any third, they created a civilization based on them. Think about that for a moment. An entire culture where the fundamental human need for rest had been weaponized, systematized, and turned into the foundation of economic success. Where sleep debt wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Jedediah Smith's brigade developed what became known as the Circle Formation. 20 men sleeping with their feet touching in the center, rifle barrels pointed outward like the spokes of a deadly wheel. Any movement by any man would instantly wake all of them through vibrations transmitted through their connected feet. The formation worked so well that Smith's men went an entire winter without losing a single man to surprise attacks. But the psychological cost was devastating. Men who slept in the circle formation for months reported that they could never again sleep alone. The absence of other heartbeats, other breathing patterns, other bodies sharing their vigilance, made solitary rest impossible. Joe Walker, the man who would later guide the first wagon trains across the Sierra Nevada, trained himself to sleep exactly 18 minutes at a time. Not 19 minutes, not 17, 18. His internal clock became so precise that he functioned as his brigade's human alarm system, waking every 18 minutes throughout the night to scan for threats before returning to unconsciousness. But Walker's technique came with a price that nobody anticipated. After 2 years of 18-minute sleep cycles, his brain began fragmenting his dreams into 18-minute segments. He would dream the same dream night after night, advancing it exactly 18 minutes each time before waking. Walker claimed he once dreamed an entire month-long journey to California, experiencing it 18 minutes at a time over dozens of actual nights. The winter of 1832 brought what historians would later call the Dream Battle of Pierre's Hole. Two brigades of sleep-deprived mountain men encountered each other in pre-dawn darkness. Both groups had been operating on less than 3 hours of sleep per night for weeks. Both groups were using advanced concealment techniques. When they spotted movement, both brigades assumed they were under attack by hostile Indians. The resulting firefight lasted 20 minutes and left 6 men dead before anyone realized they were shooting at fellow trappers. The tragedy led to new protocols. Sleep-deprived brigades would establish recognition signals, and specific bird calls, arrange stones, cloth markers, to prevent similar incidents. But it also revealed something terrifying about what these men were becoming. Their minds, pushed beyond normal limits, could no longer distinguish between reality and threat perception. Black Harris achieved something that defied medical understanding. After a harrowing escape from a Crow War party, 72 hours of continuous flight through the Yellowstone wilderness, he slept for 72 hours straight without waking once. Not just sleeping, comatose. Other trappers had to check his pulse to confirm he was still alive. This led to the tradition of death sleeping, extended recovery periods that blurred the line between rest and medical emergency. Men would designate watchers before entering death sleep, understanding that they would be completely helpless for days at a time. But even death sleeping carried risks. Old Bill Williams, already notorious for his eccentricities, began walking while sleeping during one of these recovery periods. Williams would traverse miles of wilderness in a completely unconscious state, navigating by some primitive instinct while his conscious mind remained shut down. Mountain madness reached epidemic proportions. Pierre's journal from 1835 describes men who would argue with invisible companions, who would aim rifles at shadows that existed only in their exhausted minds, who would wake up fighting battles that had ended hours earlier. The Rendezvous of 1837 saw the first official sleep competition with organized betting and formal rules. Joseph Meek, already famous for his 18-minute cycles, entered a contest to see who could maintain continuous alertness for the longest period while successfully identifying and responding to simulated threats. Meek lasted 6 days and 14 hours. He correctly identified every stage threat, successfully tracked multiple enemy movements, and maintained perfect shooting accuracy throughout the competition. Then he hallucinated for a week, convinced that beaver pelts were crawling across the ground like giant insects. But here's what's remarkable. Even while hallucinating, Meek's defensive instincts remained intact. He would wake instantly at real threats, while ignoring the imaginary ones his damaged mind was creating. His body had learned to distinguish between genuine danger and sleep deprivation phantoms. The techniques were becoming more sophisticated every year. Jim Bridger perfected rotational sleep, dividing his rest periods between multiple hidden locations throughout a single night, making it impossible for enemies to predict where he would be vulnerable. Kit Carson developed what he called echo sleeping, positioning himself where natural acoustics would amplify approaching sounds while muffling his own breathing. But the most advanced practitioners were developing abilities that bordered on supernatural. Tom Fitzpatrick, known as Broken Hand, claimed he could identify the tribal affiliation of approaching warriors by the sound of their footsteps while in light sleep. Hugh Glass allegedly woke up one night knowing that grizzly bears were approaching his camp, though no one else detected any signs of the animals until they appeared at dawn. The economics of sleep had created a hierarchy within the mountain man community. The best sleepers commanded the highest prices from fur companies. Men who could maintain alertness on 2 hours of rest per night could charge double the wages of ordinary trappers. Sleep mastery had become a marketable skill. Trading posts began keeping records of which trappers had mastered which techniques. Detailed logs noted men's sleep requirements, their alertness patterns, their vulnerability periods. This information was valuable enough that companies would steal each other's sleep intelligence, bribing clerks and traders for details about competitors' rest capabilities. By 1838, the transformation was complete. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was operated by men who had systematically broken their own sleep patterns and rebuilt them as weapons. They had created an empire where consciousness itself was currency, where rest was rationed like ammunition, where the ability to function without sleep determined life and death. But empires built on human limitation always reach a breaking point, and these men were about to discover that the mind breaks long before the body. The question wasn't whether this system was sustainable. The question was, what would happen when it finally collapsed? And collapse was coming, because no human being, no matter how strong, how adaptable, how desperately motivated, can indefinitely postpone the biological need for rest. The mountain men were about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way possible. By 1840, the bills were coming due. 15 years of systematic sleep deprivation had created the most effective wilderness fighters in human history. But it had also created something else, something darker, something that medical science wasn't equipped to understand. Liver-eating Johnson, whose real name was John Johnston, though nobody called him that after what happened in the Wind River country, developed the ability to fight while completely asleep, not drowsy, not half awake, completely unconscious. His companions would watch in terror as Johnson would suddenly stand from his bedroll, eyes closed, rifle in hand, and engage invisible enemies with deadly precision. He would reload, aim, fire, take cover, advance, retreat, AT, all while in a state of complete unconsciousness. The episodes would last anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour. Johnson nearly killed 3 of his own men during these night terrors. They would try to wake him and find themselves fighting for their lives against a man whose sleeping mind had identified them as mortal threats. The winter of 1841 became known as the Walking Death season. 12 mountain men walked off cliffs or into rivers while sleepwalking. 12. In a single winter. Men whose conscious minds had mastered every aspect of wilderness survival, but whose unconscious minds had become their worst enemies. Brigades began tying their men to trees at night, not as punishment, but as life-saving protocol. A rope around the waist, secured to a sturdy trunk, became the only way to prevent exhausted trappers from wandering into fatal danger while unconscious. Doc Newell, one of the few mountain men with actual medical training, began documenting what he called the sleep sickness. His journals from this period read like horror stories. Men whose eyes wouldn't fully close, even in deepest sleep. Backs permanently bent from years of sleeping in defensive crouches. Hands that clutched invisible rifles, even when their owners were unconscious. But the worst symptom was what Newell called false awakening syndrome. Men would dream they had woken up, would dream they were going about their daily routines. He would dream they were alert and scanning for threats. Meanwhile, their actual bodies remained unconscious and vulnerable. Pegleg Smith, one of the most respected brigade leaders in the mountains, shot his own brother during one of these episodes. Smith dreamed he was under attack by Arapaho warriors. In his dream, he was defending his camp, firing at approaching enemies. In reality, he was shooting at his brother David, who had been trying to wake him from a nightmare. David Smith died instantly. Pegleg Smith never recovered from what he had done. He exiled himself to the deepest wilderness, became a hermit, and eventually went completely insane. Other mountain men would occasionally encounter him, talking to his dead brother, arguing with phantoms, living in a world where dreams and reality had become indistinguishable. Trading posts began reporting mountain men who hadn't truly slept in years, not light sleeping, not tactical resting. They had stopped experiencing actual sleep entirely. Their brains existed in a permanent twilight state between waking and dreaming, never fully conscious, never fully unconscious. These men could still function. They could trap beaver, navigate wilderness, fight when necessary, but they had lost something essential to human existence. They had lost the ability to turn off their vigilance, even for minutes at a time. The concept of sleep debt emerged from this period. Men began to understand that they were borrowing consciousness from their future selves, and that eventually the debt would have to be repaid. But many discovered they had borrowed so much that repayment was impossible. They had pushed their minds so far beyond normal limits that return to normal sleep patterns became physiologically impossible. Jim Bridger, the man who had mastered sleeping while standing, began experiencing what he called memory dreams. He would dream about events that had never happened, but the dreams were so vivid that he couldn't distinguish them from actual memories. Bridger would tell elaborate stories about adventures that existed only in his sleep-deprived mind, convinced they were true. Kit Carson developed chronic waking nightmares. His exhausted brain would overlay dream imagery onto his actual vision. He would see attacking warriors who weren't there, charging buffalo in empty meadows, burning forests in calm weather. Carson learned to function while hallucinating, using his other senses to navigate reality while his vision showed him horrors that existed only in his mind. The psychological damage was becoming hereditary. Children of mountain men were developing their own sleep disorders, trained from birth to wake at whispers, to sleep in defensive positions, to treat rest as a vulnerability rather than a necessity. These children, raised in an environment where sleep meant death, were growing up with nervous systems calibrated for constant threat. Trading posts reported entire families who couldn't sleep indoors. The children would pile leaves in corners of trading post rooms, creating primitive nests that mimicked the outdoor conditions their parents had trained them to associate with safety. The sound of wind through walls, rather than wind through trees, triggered panic responses. The suicide rate among mountain men began climbing. Men who had survived decades in the wilderness, who had outwitted every conceivable threat, were killing themselves because they could no longer endure the constant alertness their minds demanded. Their brains had become prisons from which sleep offered no escape. But here's what makes this period so tragic. Even as their minds deteriorated, these men remained incredibly effective at what they did. A mountain man experiencing chronic hallucinations could still track game better than any normal person. A trapper who hadn't truly slept in months could still detect approaching danger with supernatural accuracy. The techniques they had developed were so effective that they continued working even when the men using them were clinically insane. Joseph Meek, the man who had won the Great Sleep Competition, began experiencing what he called time slipping. He would lose hours, sometimes entire days, with no memory of what had occurred. His companions would find him standing motionless in the wilderness, staring at nothing, completely unresponsive. When he returned to consciousness, Meek would have no recollection of the lost time. But even during these episodes, Meek's defensive instincts remained active. His body would maintain perfect stillness, perfect camouflage, perfect positioning for observing threats. His unconscious mind continued executing survival protocols, even when his conscious mind had completely shut down. The mountain men had created the ultimate paradox. They had developed sleep techniques so effective that they worked even when sleep itself became impossible. They had trained their bodies so thoroughly for vigilance that consciousness became involuntary, alertness became automatic, and rest became a memory rather than an experience. By 1842, the transformation was complete. The Rocky Mountains were populated by men who existed in a twilight state between sanity and madness, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between life and death. They had won the battle against sleep, but in winning, they had lost something essentially human. The question was no longer whether they could continue. The question was whether civilization could accommodate what they had become. When civilization finally came looking for the mountain men, it discovered something that medical science couldn't explain and society couldn't accommodate. men who could no longer sleep like human beings. Jim Bridger, the legendary mountain man who had mastered every conceivable wilderness skill, built what can only be described as a fortress bedroom in his trading post. Gun ports cut into the walls, escape tunnels leading to 3 different exits, tripwires connected to bells, a ceiling mirror angled to provide a view of all approaches. Bridger couldn't rest without defensive preparations that would have impressed a military engineer. But even with all these precautions, he rarely slept more than 20 minutes at a time. His internal alarm system, calibrated by decades in the wilderness, simply wouldn't allow longer periods of unconsciousness. The wives of returning mountain men reported husbands who would leap from bed at the sound of house cats walking across wooden floors, men who would grab rifles and scan the darkness when wind rattled windows, men who would patrol their homes all night, checking locks, examining shadows, ensuring their family's safety against threats that existed only in their hypervigilant minds. Joe Meek became a pathetic figure in the Oregon settlements. This man who had once been the most celebrated mountain man in the Rockies couldn't sleep indoors. The air felt suffocating. The walls felt like traps. The absence of wind through trees, of natural acoustics, of the thousands of subtle sounds that had kept him alive for decades, made indoor rest impossible. Meek slept in his yard, every night, in all weather. His neighbors would see him arranged in tactical positions among his vegetables, rifle across his chest, eyes scanning the darkness for threats that never came. Children of mountain men developed their own disorders. They had been trained from birth to wake at whispers, to sleep with weapons ready, to treat rest as a tactical decision rather than a biological necessity. These children couldn't adjust to civilized bedtimes, couldn't sleep in soft beds, couldn't understand why their parents jumped at every unfamiliar sound. Military recruitment officers attempting to enlist former mountain men as scouts for Western campaigns discovered that many of these legendary fighters were now unemployable, not because they lacked skills, but because they literally couldn't sleep in military camps. The army required soldiers who could rest on command, who could sleep in groups, who could function within structured schedules. Mountain men had become creatures of individual vigilance, incapable of trusting their safety to others, unable to synchronize their rest patterns with military requirements. Desertion rates among recruited mountain men reached 90%, not because they were cowards, but because the military environment triggered psychological responses that made sleep impossible. These men would abandon their posts not to avoid danger, but to find the isolation necessary for rest. The suicide rate climbed higher. Kit Carson's journals from this period describe the agony of men who had saved civilization through their wilderness skills, only to discover that civilization had no place for what they had become. Men who wrote suicide notes about nightmares that never ended, about minds that couldn't stop scanning for threats, about the impossibility of explaining their condition to people who had never needed to sleep with one eye open. Dr. Marcus Whitman, ISA, the missionary physician in Oregon Territory, ISA, attempted to document what he called wilderness sleep syndrome. His medical reports describe symptoms that wouldn't be understood for another century: chronic hypervigilance, fragmented sleep architecture, conditioned arousal responses, post-traumatic stress manifestations. But Whitman's most disturbing discovery was that these symptoms were irreversible. Men who had spent decades training their minds for constant alertness couldn't untrain those responses. Their nervous systems had been permanently rewired for survival conditions that no longer existed. Tom Fitzpatrick, broken hand, attempted to run a normal trading business in St. Louis. Within 6 months, he was sleeping in his store's basement with barricaded doors and rifle ports cut into the walls. Customers would find him pale and shaking, convinced that competitors were planning to attack his business. The sound of normal commercial activity, footsteps on wooden sidewalks, horses in the street, conversations through walls, triggered constant alarm responses. Fitzpatrick eventually returned to the wilderness, unable to tolerate the sensory environment of civilized life. But here's what makes this period so tragic. These men retained all their wilderness skills. A mountain man who couldn't sleep in a normal bed could still track game across impossible terrain. A trapper who jumped at house cats could still detect approaching danger with supernatural accuracy. Their abilities hadn't diminished, but those abilities had become their prison. The irony was devastating. Men who had mastered consciousness itself were now slaves to that mastery. They had learned to weaponize sleep so effectively that they could never again experience sleep as comfort, as rest, as escape from vigilance. Wives reported husbands who would test their food for poison, not from paranoia, but from ingrained habits developed during decades when poisoned waterholes and contaminated meat were genuine threats. Men who would examine their own homes like potential battlefields, identifying cover positions, escape routes, defensive advantages. The children suffered most. They watched their fathers transform from legendary heroes into broken men who couldn't adapt to the very civilization they had helped create. Children grew up understanding that their fathers had sacrificed something essential, the ability to rest peacefully, for the family's current security. But the sacrifice was ongoing. These men couldn't turn off their vigilance even in their own homes, surrounded by their own families, protected by the law and military they had helped establish. Their minds continued executing survival protocols in environments where survival was guaranteed. Some families developed accommodations. Wives would learn to wake their husbands gradually, avoiding sudden movements that might trigger violent responses. Children would learn to announce their presence when approaching sleeping fathers, using specific phrases that identified them as family rather than threats. But these accommodations only highlighted the tragedy. Men who had been the most effective wilderness fighters in history couldn't trust their own families enough to sleep peacefully in their presence. The mountain men had paid the ultimate price for their mastery. They had learned to survive in the wilderness by abandoning their ability to live in civilization. They had saved the frontier by sacrificing their ability to enjoy the homes and families that frontier had made possible. And the most tragic part? They would make the same choice again. Because in those mountains, during those years, the alternative to sleepless vigilance was death. They had traded their peace for their lives, and they had gotten exactly what they bargained for. Now they had to live with the bargain. The United States Army had a problem. Westward expansion was accelerating, and they needed soldiers who could fight like mountain men. But mountain men couldn't fight like soldiers, so the military did something unprecedented. They systematically studied madness and turned it into doctrine. Kit Carson became the Army's first official instructor in what they called extended vigilance techniques. Carson, the man who had perfected 20-minute sleep cycles, was tasked with teaching cavalry, units to function on minimal rest during Apache campaigns in the Southwest. But Carson discovered something disturbing. The techniques that had saved his life in the mountains were destroying the minds of young soldiers who hadn't spent decades building up to them. Men who tried to adopt mountain man sleep patterns without the gradual conditioning experienced immediate psychological breakdown. The Army's solution was typically systematic and typically brutal. They developed a graduated program of sleep deprivation, slowly training soldiers to function on less and less rest until they could maintain alertness during multi-day campaigns. The first military survival manual incorporating mountain wisdom was published in 1846. Titled Defensive Rest in Hostile Territory, it included detailed instructions on sleeping in extreme cold, creating defensive positions, maintaining vigilance for extended periods, and recognizing the symptoms of sleep deprivation madness. The manual was distributed to every Western garrison. Within 2 years, Army physicians were reporting an epidemic of sleep disorders among frontier troops. Railroad construction crews building the Transcontinental Railroad hired former mountain men to teach defensive sleeping techniques to workers in hostile territory. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific companies understood that construction crews were basically military targets, isolated, vulnerable, carrying valuable supplies through territory controlled by Native American tribes fighting for their survival. Jim Bridger contracted with the Union Pacific to train entire construction gangs. His techniques, the compass sleep formation, sentinel sleeping, tactical rest positions, became standard protocols for railroad crews working beyond military protection. But the psychological cost was enormous. Railroad workers who learned mountain man sleep techniques developed the same disorders that plagued their teachers. Men who couldn't sleep in bunkhouses, who patrolled construction camps all night, who jumped at the sound of hammers on rails because their minds interpreted rhythmic noise as approaching horses. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, America's first national law enforcement organization, actively recruited former mountain men to train agents in sleep deprivation resistance. Alan Pinkerton understood that effective surveillance required the ability to maintain alertness for days at a time while remaining undetected. Joe Walker, the man who had perfected 18-minute sleep cycles, became Pinkerton's chief instructor in what they called sustained observation techniques. Walker trained detective agents to sleep in shifts while maintaining surveillance on suspects, to recognize the early symptoms of hallucination, to function effectively while operating on 2 hours of rest per day. Pinkerton agents using these techniques successfully broke some of the most significant criminal cases of the 1850s, but they also experienced the highest rates of suicide and mental breakdown in American law enforcement history. Wells Fargo adopted the compass sleep method for stagecoach guards traveling through bandit territory. Guards would arrange themselves according to cardinal directions during rest stops, ensuring that approaching threats would be detected regardless of direction. The technique was so effective that Wells Fargo expanded it into a comprehensive defensive protocol. Drivers, guards, and passengers were trained to sleep in formations that maximize surveillance coverage while minimizing vulnerability. Stage stops were redesigned to accommodate tactical sleep positions, but success came with the usual price. Wells Fargo guards developed chronic sleep disorders, hypervigilance syndromes, and what company physicians called road madness, the inability to rest when not in motion. Buffalo Soldiers, this is African American cavalry units assigned to frontier duty, credited mountain man techniques with their survival against numerically superior Native American forces. These soldiers, fighting in some of the most dangerous territory in the American West, adopted modified versions of circle formation sleeping, sentinel rotation systems, and advanced vigilance protocols. The Buffalo Soldiers' success rates were extraordinary, but their psychological casualty rates were equally extraordinary. Military physicians reported that Buffalo Soldier units had 3 times the normal rate of sleep disorders and twice the normal rate of what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions. The transformation of individual madness into institutional methodology was complete by 1860. What had begun as desperate survival adaptations by isolated mountain men had become official military doctrine, corporate security protocols, and law enforcement standard operating procedures. The United States military had successfully weaponized insomnia. American businesses had institutionalized sleep deprivation. Law enforcement had systematized vigilance disorders. And it worked. American expansion across the continent succeeded partially because the nation had learned to deploy soldiers, workers, and agents who could function without normal sleep patterns. The techniques developed by mountain men gave American forces decisive advantages in conflicts where traditional military approaches failed, but the human cost was staggering. Every institution that adopted mountain man sleep techniques experienced corresponding epidemics of psychological disorders. The army, the railroads, the detective agencies, the shipping companies all discovered that teaching men to abandon normal sleep patterns created men who could never return to normal sleep patterns. The Mountain Men had created something that was simultaneously America's greatest tactical advantage and its most tragic human cost. They had discovered that consciousness itself could be weaponized, but they had also discovered that weapons always exact a price from the people who wield them. The techniques that secured the American frontier also secured the American asylum system, because the men who learned to never truly sleep eventually needed places where their sleeplessness wouldn't endanger others. The Mountain Men had given America the tools to conquer a continent, but they had also given America a permanent population of men whose minds had been broken in service to booze, that conquest. The question was whether the conquest had been worth the price, and that question would haunt American military doctrine for the next century and a half. In 2003, a Navy SEAL operating in the mountains of Afghanistan discovered something remarkable. When his team was pinned down by Taliban fighters in terrain eerily similar to the Rocky Mountains, he instinctively adopted a sleeping position that allowed him to rest while maintaining perfect surveillance of potential approach routes. He had never been taught this technique, he had never read about it. But something in his training, in his genetic memory, in the collective consciousness of American warriors, had preserved the knowledge that Jim Bridger had perfected 160 years earlier. The SEAL was practicing tree sleeping, SESE, resting while standing against a vertical surface, remaining instantly ready for combat. This is where our story becomes truly extraordinary, because the techniques that nearly destroyed the Mountain Men have not only survived, they have become the foundation of modern special operations warfare. Navy SEALs in Afghanistan and Iraq routinely use modified versions of Kit Carson's 20-minute sleep cycles during long-range reconnaissance missions. The official term is tactical napping, but the technique is identical to what Carson developed while trapping beaver in the 1820s. Army Rangers employ circle formation, sleeping, feet touching, weapons oriented outward, during operations in hostile territory. The formation has been updated with modern communications equipment and night vision devices, but the core principle remains unchanged from Jedediah Smith's original design. Delta Force operators practice what they call sentinel rotation, individual team members maintaining partial consciousness while others rest, using vocal cues and environmental awareness to detect threats. This is a direct descendant of the story. Sleeping techniques developed at Green River Rendezvous gatherings. But it's not just military applications. The resurrection of Mountain Man sleep tactics extends across multiple aspects of modern extreme performance. Ultramarathon runners have rediscovered Joe Walker's 18-minute sleep cycles for covering impossible distances. Dean Karnazes, the man who ran 350 miles without stopping, uses a modified version of Walker's technique, micro-sleeping while continuing to run, maintaining consciousness for navigation while allowing portions of his brain to rest. Arctic explorers routinely adopt the compass sleep formation when tent stakes fail in polar storms. Modern expeditions to Antarctica and the Arctic Circle use sophisticated equipment, but when that equipment fails, they fall back on techniques that kept mountain men alive in similar conditions 2 centuries ago. Wilderness therapy programs specifically teach troubled veterans mountain man sleep techniques as treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. The irony is profound. Techniques that created psychological disorders in the 1800s are now being used to treat psychological disorders in the 21st century. But here's what's most remarkable about this modern application. Therapists have discovered that veterans who learn controlled sleep disruption techniques often experience relief from combat nightmares. By voluntarily adopting the hypervigilant sleep patterns that mountain men developed, modern warriors regain some sense of control over their unconscious minds. Sleep researchers at Stanford University have validated what mountain men knew through brutal experience. Human beings can adapt to almost any sleep pattern if survival depends on it. Dr. William Dement's sleep laboratory has documented cases of individuals who, under extreme stress, develop the ability to enter REM sleep in 90-second intervals. This is exactly what Kit Carson was doing in 1825. He was accessing restorative sleep in impossibly brief windows, allowing his brain to maintain essential functions while preserving alertness. Modern neuroscience has proven that Carson's techniques weren't just psychological adaptations, they were fundamental rewiring of sleep architecture. Fire departments in major cities now train their personnel using modified versions of Mountain Man vigilance protocols. Firefighters working multi-day wildfire suppression campaigns use sentinel sleeping, tactical napping, and compass formation rest to maintain effectiveness while operating on minimal sleep. The results are extraordinary. Firefighter effectiveness during extended campaigns has increased dramatically since these techniques were introduced. But fire departments also report increased rates of sleep disorders among personnel, higher divorce rates, and elevated suicide risks. The same patterns that destroyed mountain men in the 1840s. Emergency room physicians working 72-hour shifts have independently developed techniques nearly identical to those perfected by Jim Bridger. They learn to sleep standing up during brief breaks, to enter light unconsciousness while remaining alert for emergency calls, to function effectively while operating in the twilight state between waking and sleeping. Medical schools now include courses on tactical rest for emergency personnel, but they also include warnings about the psychological risks, the potential for permanent sleep disruption, the difficulty of returning to normal rest patterns once these techniques are mastered. The most disturbing modern parallel involves video game competitors, AMI, professional esports athletes who compete in tournaments lasting multiple days. These competitors have developed sleep techniques remarkably similar to those used by mountain men, allowing them to maintain peak performance while operating on minimal rest. But just like their 19th century counterparts, modern esports competitors experience high rates of psychological breakdown, chronic sleep disorders, and what physicians are calling digital mountain madness, the inability to distinguish between virtual threats and actual dangers. The techniques work, they have always worked, but they exact the same price they exacted 200 years ago. Commercial airline pilots flying trans-Pacific routes use modified versions of Joe Meek's Sentinel sleeping, maintaining partial consciousness during autopilot operations while allowing portions of their brains to rest. The Federal Aviation Administration has developed official protocols based on Mountain Man techniques for managing pilot fatigue during extended flights. But airline pilots also experience elevated rates of sleep disorders, hypervigilance syndromes, and what aviation physicians call cockpit isolation syndrome, the inability to rest unless surrounded by specific environmental cues associated with flight operations. The most profound modern application involves space exploration. Astronauts on the International Space Station use techniques directly descended from Mountain Man sleep protocols. The confined space, the constant threat of equipment failure, the need for continuous vigilance, These conditions are remarkably similar to what mountain men faced in the wilderness. NASA has developed what they call microgravity sleep optimization, essentially a space-age version of compass formation, sleeping, where crew members orient themselves to maintain maximum awareness of station systems while attempting to rest. But astronauts returning from extended missions report the same symptoms that plagued returning mountain men: difficulty sleeping in normal beds, hypervigilance responses to routine sounds, the inability to rest without conducting systematic security checks of their environment. The haunting truth emerges that in Earth's wild places, whether in 1830 or today, sleep remains a luxury that must be earned through vigilance. The mountains of Afghanistan are not fundamentally different from the mountains of Montana. The psychological pressures that created the Sleepless Brotherhood still exist wherever human beings push themselves beyond the boundaries of normal survival. Modern special operations warriors who spend years operating on minimal sleep in hostile territory develop the same psychological profiles as their mountain man predecessors. They become extraordinarily effective at what they do, but they also become unable to function in normal civilian environments. The Veterans Administration now treats thousands of former Special Operations personnel for what they call tactical sleep syndrome, the inability to sleep without conducting defensive preparations, the compulsive need to maintain vigilance, even in secure environments, the psychological fragmentation that results from years of treating rest as a tactical liability. These modern warriors join a brotherhood that stretches back to John Colter's naked run through the Montana wilderness. They are men who have learned to weaponize consciousness itself and who have paid the price that such knowledge has always demanded. The techniques perfected by mountain men continue to save lives in the modern world. Special operations forces, emergency responders, extreme athletes, and explorers all benefit from sleep protocols developed by men who trapped beaver in the Rocky Mountains 2 centuries ago. But the cost remains unchanged. Every person who learns to treat sleep as a weapon eventually discovers that weapons can turn against their wielders. Every individual who masters the art of vigilant rest eventually faces the choice between effectiveness and sanity. The ghosts of men who never truly rested remind us that consciousness itself can be shaped by necessity, and some transformations can never be undone. In the deepest wilderness, MDOP, whether geographical or reflotion, psychological, sleep remains what it has always been, a luxury for those who can afford vulnerability and a liability for those who cannot. The Sleepless Brotherhood continues. Its members wear modern uniforms and use contemporary equipment, but they face the same fundamental choice that confronted Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, the choice between rest and survival, between peace and effectiveness, between normal human consciousness and the hyper-vigilant awareness that keeps them alive in places where normal human beings die. And like their predecessors, they make the same choice. They choose survival. They choose effectiveness. They choose the transformation that saves their lives and destroys their peace. Because in the end, some prices are worth paying, even when the cost is everything you are. The mountain men taught us that human consciousness can be weaponized, that sleep itself can become a tool of survival, that the boundaries between waking and sleeping can be redrawn when necessity demands it. They also taught us that such transformations are permanent, that mastery comes with a price, and that some knowledge cannot be unlearned. Their legacy lives on in every warrior who learns to sleep with one eye open, in every explorer who discovers that rest is a luxury the wilderness cannot provide, in every person who chooses vigilance over vulnerability and accepts the consequences of that choice. The Sleepless Brotherhood endures because the conditions that created it endure. As long as human beings venture into places where consciousness means survival, there will be those who choose never to truly rest. And their sacrifice, E14-9, the permanent surrender of peaceful sleep, remains the price of pushing human capability beyond its natural limits. The mountain men paid that price willingly, knowing what they were giving up, understanding what they were becoming. Their descendants continue to make the same bargain, for the same reasons, with the same results. Some transformations are irreversible. Some prices, once paid, can never be refunded. Some choices, once made, define everything that follows. The mountain men chose to never truly sleep, and in making that choice, they changed not just their own consciousness, but the very nature of human survival in the world's most dangerous places. Their legacy is written in the sleepless nights of every modern warrior who has learned that rest is a privilege that must be earned through blood, that peace is a luxury that must be purchased with vigilance, and that the ultimate expression of human adaptation is the willingness to sacrifice one's own humanity for the chance to survive in conditions that would destroy anyone who remained fully human. The Sleepless Brotherhood lives on, and it always will, as long as there are places in this world where sleep means death and consciousness means life. Picture this. It's 1807. John Colter is running for his life through the Montana wilderness. It's completely naked. His feet are leaving bloody prints on the ice. The Blackfoot warriors hunting him through the frozen night don't know they're chasing a man who will help birth an entirely new breed of human being. A man who has learned to transform sleep itself into a weapon. Now, here's the thing that gets me about this moment. Colter isn't just running from death. He's running towards something that will fundamentally change what it means to be awake in the American wilderness. Because in the decades that follow, men like him will push the boundaries of human consciousness so far beyond normal limits that they'll create a brotherhood of the perpetually vigilant, men who literally forget how to sleep like civilized human beings. And it starts with Manuel Lisa's 1st Brigade heading up the Missouri River in 1808. Think about what these men packed. Really think about it. Feather pillows. Actual feather pillows. They hauled these things up the Missouri River like they were heading to some frontier bed and breakfast. Within 6 months, they were burning those same pillows for warmth, learning to rest their heads on stone and snow instead of down and cotton. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened one sleepless night at a time. Hugh Glass. Yes, that Hugh Glass, the one who would later crawl 200 miles after a grizzly bear tried to turn him into dinner, perfected the art of sleeping in hollowed logs packed with moss. Not because it was comfortable. Comfort was a luxury that got you killed. He did it because a log offered protection on 3 sides, and moss muffled the sound of your breathing. But Glass was just one man learning one technique. What was happening across the entire fur trade was something unprecedented in human history. These weren't soldiers following orders. These weren't explorers with government backing. These were entrepreneurs, gamblers, and desperados who were systematically rewiring their own nervous systems for profit. Jim Beckwourth, mountain man, trader, and one of the most fascinating characters you'll never hear enough about, discovered what they called the compass sleep method. Picture 20 men arranged like the points of a compass, feet pointing toward cardinal directions. Why? Because when you're that exhausted, your body loses its ability to sense approaching danger. But if you align yourself with magnetic north, some primitive part of your brain stays oriented even in the deepest sleep. The Crow Indians taught them this, and here's what's incredible. It worked. That first winter, this technique saved 12 documented lives. 12 times, men woke up knowing exactly which direction death was approaching from. Old Pierre Menard, Sleepier, veteran trader and meticulous record keeper, half-court documented 37 different sleeping positions his men developed. 37, each one designed for specific terrains and threat levels. The cliff sleep for mountain ledges, the root sleep for forest floors, the stone sleep for desert camps, the water sleep for riverbanks where the sound of current masked footsteps. These weren't just survival techniques. They were the birth of a new kind of human consciousness. The Crow had another trick that sounds impossible until you realize these men's lives depended on impossible things becoming possible. They taught the mountain men to sleep with one eye literally open, not metaphorically, literally. The eyelid would rest half closed, allowing just enough vision to detect movement while maintaining enough darkness for the brain to enter sleep cycles. Modern sleep researchers would tell you this is medically impossible, but tell that to the families of the 12 men whose lives it saved that first winter. Now, think about this. What were these men giving up? They were abandoning one of the most basic human needs, the need for deep, restorative sleep, in exchange for what? Money? Adventure? Freedom? No. They were trading their ability to sleep for the right to stay alive in a landscape that killed most men who entered it. The psychological cost was immediate and brutal. Pierre Menard's journals describe men who would jerk awake at the sound of wind through pine needles, men whose hands would instinctively reach for rifles that weren't there when they heard unfamiliar sounds, men who developed what we would now recognize as hypervigilance disorders. But here's what makes this story so compelling. They kept going. They kept pushing deeper into territories where sleep meant death. They kept developing new techniques, new ways of staying conscious, when consciousness itself became a survival skill. The beaver trade was exploding. Every stream, every valley, every hidden corner of the Rocky Mountains represented potential fortune. But fortunes went to the men who could trap during the day and stay alert through the night. Sleep became the luxury that separated the living from the dead. And the men who mastered this balance? They became legends. Kit Carson would eventually perfect the 20-minute sleep cycle, micro-naps that allowed him to cover twice the territory of his competitors. Jim Bridger would develop the ability to sleep standing against trees for days at a time, earning a reputation as the man who never fully slept. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1807, these techniques were still being discovered. Men were still dying because they slept too deeply, or in the wrong positions, or in places where their snoring could be heard by enemies a quarter-mile away. The learning curve was written in blood. What fascinates me about this period is how quickly human adaptation can occur when the alternative is extinction. These men weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people pushed into extraordinary circumstances, and when faced with the choice between sleep and survival, they chose survival, again and again and again, until choosing survival became so automatic that they forgot how to choose anything else. The Shoshone had a phrase for what these men were becoming. Roughly translated, it meant those who dream while walking, who walk while dreaming. Men caught between consciousness and unconsciousness, existing in a twilight state that allowed them to function in a landscape that would kill normal human beings. But functioning came at a cost. Always, there was a cost. By 1810, fur traders were reporting men who would sleep for 3 days straight after returning from the mountains, then pace their cabins for weeks, unable to rest indoors. Men whose eyes never fully closed, even in deepest sleep. Men who had trained their bodies so thoroughly to be ready for violence that peaceful sleep became physically impossible. The rendezvous gatherings, those legendary summer meetings where mountain men would trade furs, swap stories, and reconnect with what remained of civilization, became laboratories for sleep experimentation. Men would compare techniques, trade secrets, demonstrate new methods of staying alert while appearing unconscious. And through it all, one truth emerged. In the wilderness, sleep wasn't rest. Sleep was strategy. The question that haunted these early mountain men, the question that would define the next 3 decades of fur trading, was simple. How long can a human being maintain this level of vigilance before something fundamental breaks? They were about to find out, because what started with John Colter running naked through the Montana night was about to become an empire built on the systematic destruction of one of humanity's most basic needs. An empire where sleep itself would become both currency and weapon, where rest would be rationed like ammunition, and where the ability to stay awake would separate the living from the dead. The Sleepless Brotherhood was born, and once you joined it, there was no going back. The mountains were calling, fortunes were waiting, and sleep. Sleep was for men who valued comfort over gold, rest over glory, peace over the kind of money that could change everything. These men chose differently, and that choice would transform not just their own consciousness, but the very nature of survival in the American wilderness. But first, they had to learn the rules of their new existence. Rules written not in books, but in the accumulated wisdom of men who had figured out how to stay alive when staying alive should have been impossible. And the first rule was simple. In the mountains, when you close your eyes, you better be ready to open them fighting.